Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to Other Minds and Hands. This is episode number 73, and today Maggie and I are fortunate enough to be joined again by Jordan Rannells as we get a chance.
Hello.
So we were, of course, planning to have one discussion with Jordan talking about his audio adaptations, but there was so much last time, even just to kind of wrap our heads around what was happening in, Jordan, the work that you do, that we ran out of time to have the sort of further discussion that we really wanted to have. So
I think we were utterly flabbergasted by the genius, the work, the levels of detail. Like any thought of previous conversation went out the window because we had to grapple with this new reality that you had created.
Well,
yeah,
I'm
and it's funny. I mean,
it's got your attention.
even as someone who had listened to it before, I was just amazed. I mean, it's so much. Yeah, just to see all of the thought and planning that goes into it. So let's, first of all, let's start off
I'm
with...
already going to jump straight into that, though,
yeah.
because like the joy that you brought me from that conversation is how I felt watching the special features of Return of the King. Like
Right.
when you get the extended edition and you see how the sausage is made, I just appreciate the art so much more.
Mhm.
So you gave us that little sneak. Like I already enjoyed the work, the bits that I had heard, and then I appreciated the work, you know?
Yeah.
Well,
absolutely.
to kind of kick it off, just from my side, and then I'll pass it off to you guys. Like those appendices were really the thing that sparked my interest into all of this stuff, into movies and filmmaking and audio and everything like that. So it's funny that you say that because it all kind of it all somehow ends up coming back to that. Those documentaries for sure.
Yeah.
You and me both, friend.
Absolutely. So, Jordan, you had mentioned you'd had maybe something else to play for us, just to kind of reorient people. I know there'll be some people who will be listening this week who maybe missed last week. So just to kind of reorient people to, a fresh example of the kind of thing that you're doing to kind of launch us into our more theoretical discussion here today.
Yeah, definitely. If it's okay with you guys, I was going to play a quick sample from Bridge of Khazad-dûm.
Nice.
With Andy, if that's okay.
Yeah.
It'll be like 2-3 minutes, I think. But this will kind of compare to last time where this is an action sequence. And so we get to see a lot of sound effects happening specifically to what he's saying and having it line up really directly. So again, for people that might not have caught before, all of the music, all the sound effects, and all the ambience are things that I have designed or written and put in there. And the narration is obviously Andy Serkis.
And of course, we remind people, if you're not wearing headphones, you totally want to put headphones on if possible.
And I totally forgot my headphones.
Oh no.
I'm like, I might go get them for the first 10 seconds of this so I can tune in. It's on the table.
Definitely.
Yeah.
We'll test the audio quickly, make sure.
Back to the hall.
You hear that?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. That's another piece of our guess the scene. You get 2 seconds of audio, and
it was exactly. It was funny as well. I mean, one that includes words that's easy, right? But I was thinking of this, Jordan. I was working the other night, and I was just listening to the soundscape alone without the words. And I listened to the first 3 chapters of book 3 of the Two Towers that way, and in particular with the Uruk-hai chapter. Right. I was like, there were so many times I'm like, wait a second, I know exactly which paragraph we're at now. And there were things that I noticed that that really drew, it really drew my attention to some things. For instance, just listening to the soundscape, I was like, man, there are way more horses in this than I expected there to be. Like, I mean, I like, if you just asked me, like, how many passages do like galloping horses like actually appear? Like, they talk about it sometimes, but there aren't that many. And then I'm listening through, I'm like, man, there are lots and lots of horses in this chapter. So I was like going back and looking at it.
There's a lot of examples of a really good example of what you just said was not galloping horses, but an example is when they go to Old Man Willow. It took me a little while to figure out like when should certain sounds go away? Like when does because they have the pony with them, right?
Right.
Or ponies.
Ponies, yeah.
Yeah. So when does that stop? And it's kind of hard to figure out where that happens.
Yes.
So there's a lot of like, we mention the horses and then you as the reader forget them, but they're still there the whole time.
Yes.
Idling or whatever it might be. So
Idling.
lots of in the background things.
Yes.
I have a lot of horse idling tracks that are, just the reins moving and sounds like that. So
Right.
a lot of fun. But yeah, we can dive in if we're ready.
Yeah, definitely.
So this is from the Bridge of Khazad-dûm.
On the 7th level, that is 6 above the level of the gates. Come now, back to the hall. Gandalf had hardly spoken these words when there came a great noise, a rolling boom that seemed to come from depths far below, and to tremble in the stone at their feet. They sprang towards the door in alarm. Doom! Doom! It rolled again, as if huge hands were turning the very caverns of Moria into a vast drum. Then there came an echoing blast. A great horn was blown in the hall, and answering horns and harsh cries were heard further off. There was a hurrying sound of many feet. "They are coming," cried Legolas. "We cannot get out," said Gimli. "Drat!" cried Gandalf. "Why did I delay? Here we are, caught just as they were before. But I was not here then. We will see what doom came the drum beat, and the walls shook. "Slam the doors and wedge them," shouted Aragorn, "and keep your packs on as long as you can. We may get a chance to cut our way out yet." "No," said Gandalf, "we must not get shut in. Keep the east door ajar. We will go that way if we get a chance." Another harsh horn call and shrill cries rang out. Feet were coming down the corridor. There was a ring and clatter as the company drew their swords. Glamdring shone with a pale light, and Sting glinted at the edges. Boromir set his shoulder against the western door. "Wait a moment. Do not close it yet," said Gandalf. He sprang forward to Boromir's side and drew himself up to his full height. "Who comes hither to disturb the rest of Balin, Lord of Moria?" he cried in a loud voice. There was a rush of hoarse laughter, like the fall of sliding stones into a pit. Amid the clamor, a deep voice was raised in command. "Doom! Boom! Doom!" went the drums in the deep. With a quick movement, Gandalf stepped before the narrow opening of the door and thrust forward his staff. There was a dazzling flash that lit the chamber and the passage outside. For an instant, the wizard looked out. Arrows whined and whistled down the corridor as he sprang back. "There are orcs, very many of them," he said, "and some are large and evil, black Uruks of Mordor. For the moment they are hanging back, but there is something else there. A great cave troll, I think."
Stop it there.
Excellent.
There we go.
I love there are lots of places in the soundscape as a whole when the music that you do is almost like part of the ambient sound. Right?
Almost diegetic.
Yeah.
Almost.
Yeah. Almost.
It's a fine line of like, and that's probably the strongest example of the horns, because there are actually horn sound effects, but it's also the horn section playing. So it's fun to try and you'll hear there was a couple times in there where there was no percussion section playing the doom thing, and that is a conversation we'll get into more as we go. Is it going to hit every time? Is it going to hit sometimes? What's the line with that? So that one was a lot of fun, though. A lot of fun.
And you can feel the movement of that one too, which I really enjoyed. If like it wasn't just the repetitive stuff. I mean, if you looked at me and Corey, we were both kind of doing that very well. But the way that it built too, it just really matched the tension of that scene. So when it does break, it's really effective.
Yeah. That scene gets really fun when, as it progresses, I guess you could say. There's a lot of, it's a kind of a roller coaster chapter where it's really high action and then it goes to nothing and then back up and then back down.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah. But like that, so that I would say that the music there is a good deal more sort of insistent as a part of the experience, right? Again, like so many other places, like in the Shire, for instance, again, there's often music there, but again, it sometimes it barely registers with me anyway, more than, like the sound of the birds and the wind in the trees, registers. But that there, the swelling music and, the rising music as it comes through becomes, I think, a really central part of that, of the experience of that whole passage.
Yeah, and it fluctuates through the whole thing. Some moments will be score heavy, some will be ambience heavy, sound effects heavy, whatever it might be. And a good thing to keep in mind too is with the kind of global scale of it. A really good example might be the very first chapter of book 6 is very up close and personal with Sam, right? So you hear a lot of every movement and you hear the orc like run by and trip and stuff, and the music is very up close and personal too. But as we progress further, the music, I should say the soundscape, like the books, kind of get further and further away from the close-up action. So that means that there's going to be like in The Steward and the King, there's going to be less individual sound effects and more score taking over at that point, and more of a grand score at that point. So yeah, it fluctuates for sure.
That's such a great example of your process, though, that you're thinking not just of the through line, but where our focus should be. Because, like you were saying, Corey, so often the ambient noise is just ambient. It sucks us in a really gentle, vague way that we're part of the story and participating in it. But the music can really bring you in. So using that as the lens to kind of guide the audience as to where their focus should be without making it deliberate, that's chef's kiss.
And you could say that the opposite is also true, that the music can easily take you out of it. And so I made the decision early on in the process that when there's songs or poetry, those are not scored at all.
Yes, I noticed that.
And so I'll kind of just let the words do what they should on their own. And I really like that moment in the first chapter, I think it is. Everything kind of dies away and Bilbo sings and off he goes. And it's just the crickets and him walking away. And it's kind of a nice breather and a nice way to subtly signal to the listener where we're at as well.
Yeah.
That's lovely, and especially with the different performances too. I mean, Andy Serkis, I know your opinions now of that, but there's a very big element of performance, and not that there isn't with the other one, but it's more given and it feels like a recitation. So allowing both of those to do what they're intended to do without distracting is really powerful.
And trying to score it would just be a mess any way you try to do it. Like, you'd need him to re-record it to what I did or something. Otherwise, it's just going to be like, I might, in The Hobbit, there's a couple things where I might percussively add to it, like in chapter 1 of The Hobbit. But again, for the most part, especially if you're listening to it without narration, I think it's nicer to interpret that your own way. Instead of, again, forcing you to be like, this is the way that you got to hear that poetry.
So
I feel I should just give a quick disclaimer. If you can hear weird sound effects on my computer, that would be my dog chewing an antler next to me. So my apologies, but it's just
no, it's just
Merlin.
part of the ambience, of
Just
the, yeah,
Merlin
exactly.
of the Park household. Yep.
Yes. Yes. I'm sure Jordan could actually use those sounds productively.
There we go.
They're literally bone crunching, so they're pretty
Perfect.
specific.
There are definitely some occasions where that could be relevant.
We got a good
yeah.
pick for you.
Maybe some background noise for Fluffy in the Philosopher's Stone or something.
Exactly.
There you go. I was going for Denethor's feast if you're going that direction.
Yeah. So Jordan, let's think more about let's talk a little bit more about this, about your process, and about in particular the thing that I'm tempted to say, but I'm not even sure if it's correct. But the thing I'm tempted to say is that the relationship between what you're doing and the story seems to me a fundamentally different kind of relationship. There's a way in which an adaptation, when you take something in a different genre. So I've often used the metaphor of translation, right? That when you take something that's written in one genre and you are, you're putting it out in a different medium, in a different genre, it's like an act of translation, translating from one language to another, right? And of course it can't be the same thing, right? One difference with your work is that the story is there, right? I mean, it's the entire story that's still there. And in one sense, you've not altered or changed anything so it's almost like I can translate this while also allowing you to read the original at the same time, and so this is what I mean when I say it feels like the relationship to the story is a different kind of relationship than is normal in an adaptation. And yet I think it's pretty clear that a lot of the decision-making process that you're doing it has a lot in common with any other kind of adaptation. How do you render, how do you read and receive what's happening in the text at this moment, and how do you try to transmit that in your own way, right? I'd be interested to hear you talk a little bit more about that, like the connection to the story, that how you think about the relationship between what you do and the story as you go along.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think it all starts with what you said at the beginning, which is that, when you translate from one medium to another or something like that, to adapt something, I have always, since watching the extended Lord of the Rings movies, there's one particular behind the scenes thing where I can't remember who it is, but somebody says literal adaptations don't work. That's how he says it. Mm-hmm. And I was always like, I want to see you try it. I want to see it fail. So
right.
For me, I was always like, are you sure about that? Because I just can't think of an example where we've tried that and let it be exactly the same as much as you can. But I've imagined a movie that starts with someone narrating the beginning of the book and going in. You can get a lot closer than I think people are willing to believe, if you're willing to trust the audience, I guess. And so my opportunity with this project is, to take the book for exactly what it is and try and enhance that experience without altering the experience. Mm-hmm. And through the Lord of the Rings and through all the other soundscapes that I'm working on, the challenge is always what should the focus be in this scene, and how do I portray that in a way that, for Lord of the Rings, I can't, well, I shouldn't say can't. I could have gone completely in new directions for a lot of things, but that is just not a strategy that would have been effective, I don't think. Mm-hmm. And it's also just not one that I personally would have been interested in as much. There's a lot of things that we can get into later, like the way that the Mumakil sounds is an elephant. It's not like what they had with the movies, where they wanted to not make it sound like an elephant so that people wouldn't be upset by that. for me, I'm like trying to be like, well, no, it would sound like an elephant, So I'm trying to get the accuracy of it. So I think what I'm doing in terms of adapting is, how do I represent best what's being written about and what's being described without changing it too much. And it does lend itself. I talked last time about not really having writer's block in this kind of way, where I think that because I'm approaching the whole thing as if it's like a 63-hour movie, then my imagination sees it that way. And so I can kind of tell pretty quickly where I'm like, oh, I'll let the music be here, or I'll let the sound effects take over here, et cetera, like that. And so I map it out that way, again, just to try and shape it's what I think the focus is. And I had a lot of conversations with my executive producers that backed the Kickstarter. What do we think about this? What do we think about that? And but a lot of it, I think at least, like in terms of my own taste, I guess, landed pretty quickly on what I thought worked. And there's a lot of scenes that lend themselves pretty obviously to, when Sam and Frodo are in the midst of the storm, we're not going to have a ton of music over that. I want to hear the storm, you know what I mean? Hopefully that answers your question a little bit.
Yeah, no, it does. So Maggie, do you mind if I follow up just for a second?
No, go for it.
Yeah.
Go for it.
So I'm thinking about, and these terms I'm going to use are really simplistic, right? So how I say this might not really map onto how you think of it, but it strikes me that there are some things, some elements that you're doing, which are a really literal rendering of what, like when the text says this thing happened, if there's a sound that would go along with that, you're like, I'm putting in the sound, right? Like the passage you played last time of like the wagon creak, Farmer
Totally,
Maggot's going to back up his wagon. So you not only have the wagon and the horse sounds, but you put them in our ears three-dimensionally in ways that, make it sound like you're backing it up and turning it around, right? So that's one example of what I would call a sort of a literal rendering, right? Where what you're doing is like, I'm making a sound effects track for the book based on exactly what it describes, right? But then there are other moments where you're putting in sound effects that aren't actually described, but as you say, like they would be there, like you were talking about with the idling ponies, right? Like the ponies are there.
They'd be there.
Yeah, like the ponies are there. The text does not refer to them at all, right? So the normal reader experience is you totally forget about the ponies, but like there ought to be some kind of pony, some kind of reminder that there are in fact 5 ponies standing right there, right? So, so there are other places like that where you're actually sort of adding. So it's not just a literal rendering, like I'm going to put in a sound effect that isn't like directly or indirectly mentioned by the text, right? But I'm going to add other sound effects that we can understand to be there based on what the situation the text has described. And then there seems to me a third kind of category of sounds that you're doing, which are, I am trying here to capture the like feeling that this scene brings about. And I'm not even yet really talking about score so much as even just talking about sounds, like how you do the ambient sounds, right? What kind of ambient sounds you put in and how you, I'm thinking, for instance, of the really sickening spider squelching sounds you put in for Shelob, right? Yeah. Like there are moments like that where you're wanting to like create this sort of visceral connection to what's going. Again, even if there's no explicit reference to like an action or a sound effect, a sound, a thing that would create a sound, right? Or that sort of thing. But again, the goal of adding these sounds, maybe direct sounds like that, maybe ambient sounds. Or other sorts of things. I'm thinking of all the stuff in the Battle of Pelennor Field that we were looking at last time, right? Where you're trying to capture not only the sense of like, here's what it might sound like if you were there, and tailoring that, as you were pointing out, to not just like, I'm at a random spot on Pelennor Fields, but I am on the spot where the narrative focus is, right, in the story at that moment. But in any case, those three different categories that I just kind of threw out off the top of my head seem to me different kinds, like they involve different levels of interpretation, right? They all involve even the literal ones involve interpretation, right? Because like there are creaking wagons and then there are creaking wagons. Like it's, like they don't all sound alike.
I would probably say that there's 4 scenarios here.
Okay.
One might be at the very start. I'll give an example for each. So at the very start of the book, we get this big intro, and there should be sounds of us hanging out with the hobbits at the inn discussing and gossiping, but none of that's in there. The ambience doesn't start until after that, because I want the score to be the focus for that, and then it kind of enters the world after that. So kind of one version of just straight up artistic license, I guess you could say, for that.
Sure.
Then we have the literal ones that you were talking about, where this thing, Tolkien describes the sound happening, so I put it in there. And then we have the kind of situational sounds that would be there if we were in the environment. And then the 4th version is something that you might have at the end of whichever chapter. Well, it's in the Council of Elrond, and it's also in when Frodo has his dream, where there's sound effects that are not there because they're not there and we're not there, right. But we hear them because it kind of heightens the experience to have them there. So when we're in the Council of Elrond, we'll hear, the hammer and anvil sounds and whatnot as that all is being described. So yeah, it kind of flows between these 4 different iterations, and it's not really something that I actively am like, okay, I got to do this for this scene, this for this scene. It's more like what feels right, and things might go through iterations of score heavy or ambience heavy or things like that.
Yeah.
But then there's other examples, and the one that I wanted to bring up specifically was, again, thinking on the larger scale, we have all this Hobbit content for 6 books, for 6 chapters. And then we get to Tom. And when we get to Tom, the music is gone. Because Tom's the music. It was
Tom is his own soundtrack.
Well, yeah, because I was like, well, would there be score with Tom? And there is when it's Goldberry's Washing Day. There's some harp that comes in from one of my awesome guest musicians, Betsy. But
nice.
That was a good example of what is Tom? Okay, so if we go with the theory that maybe Tom is some relation to the music, then it would make sense for him to not have score around him because he doesn't need it, you could say. So that was one part of it, but the other half of it was like, well, it also gives us, the listener, a break between, some intense Willow stuff and some intense stuff that's going to happen after that. So we get a little lull in the movie, you could say, which works, I think, is the purpose of the chapter as well. And is the same thing that happens in Treebeard, where we have a lot of, walking with Treebeard and sounds and stuff. And there's score for a lot of that, but there are, like I said last time, it's a 2-hour-long chapter, so there's significant chunks that are just sound effects. And I'm trying to emulate what I think the purpose of the chapter or the purpose of the and it goes in scales, right? Like, what's the purpose of the story, or what's the purpose of the book, or the chapter, or this paragraph, or this sentence, or this specific sound effect? So yeah, just trying to zoom in, but also keep the far back view of the arcs in mind.
It's just so helpful to hear all of. Sorry.
No. Go ahead.
It's just so helpful to hear all of the thought processes, because I feel like it just hammers home the fact that this is absolutely an adaptation. So many folks are like, oh, you had how many hours to do this? That's not an adaptation. It's literal. That's absolutely an adaptation. You're making all these decisions. You might not be condensing, but you're making all these decisions about interpretation. And Nameless Arcanum in Twitch referred to this, are you not fundamentally altering the experience by making those decisions for the listener? Yes.
Yeah.
That's exactly what you're doing.
Yeah.
But the same way, we've talked about before, my most common example is the Daily Prophet in Harry Potter. When you read it, you don't picture it. You're making it up in your mind yourself. You don't know exactly what it is because it's vaguely described. But in the film, we are told visually exactly what it looks like. You don't have to make that up. You're doing the same thing. You're giving us a central point. You're giving us a focal point. You're drawing us into the story in that different way and making those decisions. So we are experiencing the story in that way. But there's such a more, I don't know, to me, it's a very beautiful, open interpretation because you still have that independent, creative spark that comes from reading, but you're in this space that's allowing you to focus a little bit more. So yes, that decision's made, but I welcome it. Bring it on.
Yeah. No, it is a very interesting experience. And there are these definite choices that you're making. Mag, I think of a thing I've talked about many times before when on Fairy Stories, when Tolkien is talking about visual adaptation, and he talks about how, like any visual adaptation, he talks about one of the advantages of writing with words, right, is that you can just use a word that leaves the reader entirely free. And of course, the example that he uses is bread, right? You say there's bread on the table, and the reader is free to envision anything that fits in the category bread, right? Unless it's really important for some reason exactly what kind of bread it is, you can just say bread. But you can't, in a visual adaptation, you can't just say bread. Like, you have to put a loaf of something on the table. And there's a sense in which you're doing a similar thing, right? The choices that you're making, the audio choices that you're making, also, like, it's not exactly the same as bread. But again, like, an example that really jumped out at me is the cry of the Nazgul, right, in the Shire, right, in the Marish, when they first hear the cry of the Nazgul in the distance in chapter 4. And like, that's a thing which normally, like, it's described a little bit in order to give you a sense of what it is, right? But it's up to you to just imagine what that sounds like. In the soundscape, we hear it, right? We can hear it off in the distance. And so now that choice has been, just like the bread on the table on stage or on a film, has been crystallized into something, right? Which may or may not fit the picture you had. The sound there has been crystallized into something which may or may not fit the picture that you had. And again, the point is not that this is a bad thing. The point is this is what is simultaneously challenging about adaptation, but also fun about adaptation, right? I come back to the phrase on which this show is based, the other minds and hands. Like, the reason to leave things to other minds and hands is that other minds and hands will see and do things differently than you will. And so to experience an adaptation is not just to consume the original in some other form, but to encounter someone else's vision of it, which may be like yours and may be unlike yours, but in any case, that I find that always an interesting experience. And there's, so in some ways, though, there's less of it. Like, it's less intrusively individual. Your soundscape is less intrusively individual in many ways than like a feature film adaptation, for instance, right?
Yeah.
But that element is still there.
Yeah, and I was thinking about things like that because, again, I'm thinking of it as a movie, but I'm thinking about it as, like, if I got to do a movie and didn't have to worry about a lot of the things that make sound design for a movie difficult. Mm-hmm. When we hear Boromir sound his horn, I can decide when, in relation to the sentence, we hear that.
Right.
And I can play with it, and it's not tied to a visual. And I find that, there's plenty of examples, trope examples, of how people are way more lenient on sound than even they think they are. Good examples are like when you see lightning strike on screen and you see the bolt and hear it at the same time. That never happens. That's not how that works. Or same with gunfire. There should be a delay. lots of things like that where, if you're watching a movie and you hear the loon sound of a bird, and that loon would never be in that environment, but that's the go-to because we like that sound. So there's a lot of things like that.
Those of us in New Hampshire are like,
yeah. There's a lot of examples of that where we're a little bit more lenient, whereas you get the opposite, where perfect example is that they just released a promo image of the new Superman costume, and everyone's got an opinion about it because we can see it and we're criticizing it. But I don't think that happens the same way with strictly audio. Not to say that the Balrog sounds a certain way, the Fell Beast sounds a certain way, etc., etc., etc. Things that you might not think of originally, but I don't think that it's. I first of all don't think that it's critiqued as harshly. Second of all, I think that having the movies is a support system for the soundscape in a lot of ways, where, like I said before, I could totally go off and do something totally new and purposefully new in every way, but I don't really understand why the need for that is there unless that original thing was not enjoyed thoroughly. You know what I mean?
Right.
Where if everyone loves Howard Shore's music, I'm gonna emulate that a little bit, because it's familiar and people like it.
Yeah.
And just as every successful adapter does, you take what has come before and you're influenced by it, whether you're aware of it or not, and potentially incorporate it. But what Corey was saying about the choices, like, I definitely think you have some flexibility in Soundscape, but the bread on the table is really important. Like, if you just had a loaf of Wonder Bread in plastic wrap, we're going to have a problem with that, Like,
Right.
It's not going to fit. It's not going to be okay. And that is where you automatically disrupt your fan engagement, your audience engagement, because you're taking them out of the story. They're judging this superficial thing that doesn't actually affect the story, but everything affects the story. So if you
that's
take
where
them-
I can lend myself to just realism, where it's like, if we were in silly example maybe is if we're in the Shire and someone knocks on the door, it's not going to sound like like a plastic or a metal door. It's going to be a wooden door.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like
Right.
things like that are really easy to get everyone to come along with you on, because it's just what it would be. And it'll definitely be trickier in something like the Wheel of Time, where what does the one power sound like? Whatever I decide that it sounds like.
Right.
Whereas with, I've said this before, but the magic in the Lord of the Rings is very earthly. It's very natural sounding, so it's a lot easier in that way. What does Treebeard sound like? He sounds like branches and logs moving.
Right.
Yeah.
It's not like, okay, I got to come up with a new sound for what that even is.
Right. Right.
And there's some examples of that, but very few in the grand scope of things, for sure.
So one of the things that I'm really interested in thinking about, I just kind of putting a little bit more pressure on the kind of interpretive decisions that you're making to sort of think about that a little bit more. Many of the things that you've said have pointed to you were just talking about realism, for instance, right? Have pointed to the fact that the number one, like, preemptive choice that you're making is to give the reader an immersive experience, right? I want you, like, the first priority is for you to sort of feel like you're there in the story. Yeah. So that's why that's why you start with ambiance, right? That's why you you do, you put in all those sound effects and everything. That's why you follow the experience of the point of view of so that, again, you're having that intimate experience of, like, I am really there in where the story takes place. But there are other moments. But the one thing which I would say almost is categorically contrary to that is the score, right? As, like, if you were there is very rarely going to be a score, right? And you
where
even
does the light come from?
Right, where does the light come from? Exactly. Yes, you pointed even in the beginning of when you were listing the kinds of decisions that you were making. That first one, where you actually deliberately remove or postpone the realistic sound effects that you would be hearing in that moment because you want to do score instead, right? Now, again, obviously, I'm not criticizing the decision to include a score, but that is that's definitely, it seems to me, a very different kind of interpretive move, right? And
Totally.
involves a very different kind of thing. So tell us more. Like, I'm especially interested in that first case, like those moments where you feel you can't do both, right? You're choosing between simple immersion, right? I'm just gonna kind of, in a sense, it's never passive. You're doing all this careful active work, but in a sense, passively like the soundscape is going to be passive in the sense that it's just going to like kind of give you the sense of what it would be and let the story happen while you're surrounded by the sounds, right? Versus active, because I'm thinking of passive and active in terms of the cues you're giving to the listener, right?
Yeah.
The score is a much more active set of cues. Like, I want you to feel this way. Like, here is what is happening in this scene, and this is how it should affect you in some way. Right? I mean, am I right about that?
Yeah, totally. There's, as I'm addressing, and we'll talk more focused on music a little bit here. As I'm going through, a lot of the time I'm deciding whether or not a scene is theme versus feel. Mm-hmm. Those are the two kind of approaches to scoring that I would have. So something like the action sequence that we played is feel.
Yes.
It's got to feel this way. Whereas when we're in Shadow of the Past and Frodo and Gandalf are talking, we're going to hear themes from Gollum, from the Nine Riders, etc., 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 to kind of maybe guide you a little bit with what we're talking about or what we should be thinking about. Council of Elrond obviously is all that kind of stuff.
It just kind of creates more of a background association between things.
Yeah,
right?
and I would interpret that maybe as the same kind of thing as, and I have to kind of give thanks to yourself and to the Prancing Pony podcast and all these other things where, you know, when we're talking with well, as we're going through the story, and a good example would be when the eucatastrophe theme comes in, right? Things that I've absorbed from everyone in the fandom and been like, you know, is the focus, like, this eucatastrophic moment is happening, so I should draw attention to the fact that it's happening, because I want to make sure everyone knows that that is a focus in there.
Right.
But as I'm going through, I think that a lot of the time, and this is going to sound scary maybe for people to hear, but there's sound effects, there's music, there's ambience, there's the narration as, you know, 4 different elements that are all, in my experience, equal, not 3 and then this one's up above the others. Because obviously you're going to focus on the words the whole time. But again, the experience is meant to be with or without that. So that's one thing. The other thing is, you know, when we're experiencing certain moments, maybe I want to emphasize certain things in the text more, and I can do that by having the score there. Or I can hint at things. A really good example is when we're with Strider and company and something is coming up through the trees. There's a horse on its way.
Yes.
And we hear the theme for Glorfindel long before he shows up. Mm-hmm. You know, it starts to kind of work its way in. Same example would be when, in the example we listened to last week, you know, Sam is starting to work himself up against Shelob, and the elven themes start to kind of power his way into that. And it's cool because you can kind of lead and guide the listener to and from certain things. And from certain things is something that I really enjoyed doing, where, you know, we might have this huge big moment, and because of how I can make the score taper, it signals to you that, like, we're going to calm down for a minute here. Mm-hmm. And so there's a lot of molding the experience maybe that you might be able to do with music, and which was mostly my goal, because like we talked about last time, the score in a movie has a chance to be the score on its own, and my score never gets to do that until the end of a few chapters. So the score can never really be like, you know, the opening title to Star Wars. You know, it can never be like that
The main character.
overwhelming. Yeah.
Right, right.
The only time it gets anywhere close to that is in the very last scene as we go off with Frodo. But
You're like, this is my moment.
pretty much, yeah. And that is a good example of a scene where people might not be down with how I did that. But for me, it's like, it's been 63 hours worth and I want to pay it all off here. You know, so
Yeah.
Also,
there
that's
is an
kind of,
element of like, this is what I want to do because I think it sounds good.
that's also a really powerful device at the end of an audiobook, right? Like an audiobook that you spent 63 hours with, that you're not quite ready to leave, and then you get this beautiful new piece of music to kind of carry you into that transition. That's great.
Yeah, I was noticing. I just I've recently begun listening through Fellowship again. So I just listened to the Conspiracy Unmasked chapter this afternoon, earlier today, and I was noticing that the Soundscape has it's like fully 2.5 minutes at the end of the narration added on of just score and sounds as we were going. And I was
That's when he has his dream, right?
Yeah. It's right after the dream.
Yeah, and there's not too many of those, but every now and then, you know, you'll have a score, an example like that where it extends after, because I think that moment is really important, and the music is a way of being like, hey, everybody, this is super important.
Right. Stop and
then
linger on this for a second.
Yeah. But then there's other examples where it would be almost too jarring to end it right away. And a good example is, there might be 2 chapters that do this. I can't remember off the top of my head, but when the Ride of the Rohirrim, you know, when they charge off, and then it ends like right there, right as it's starting almost. And I was like, hey, well, we got to hear the horses run off.
Yes, right. It's going to sound like the horses ran off a cliff or something.
Yeah, exactly. So there's definitely interpretation to those types of things.
Yeah.
And I try to make it, you know, just whatever feels best for the moment to make it kind of encapsulating experience as much as possible.
On that, there was a really good question that now I'm curious about too. Did you have to re-record any bits about the 2 recordings? So you've got these 2 different narrators. Were there moments that just called for something different from one to the other?
I will say no initially, and with the caveat that when I have more time, I want to go through and more finely adjust those things if I need to. But a lot of the time, you know, because there's so much time, it works that you can like take this section of the score out, and a lot of the times some of the times I would move the score independently of the sound effects and things like that to make certain things line up. So it is, if you think about it, a different experience. You know, it's not just like I moved everything to fit with the new one. It's different in some ways. And you'll listen to, you know, the action scenes in particular might be some moments where it might land slightly differently, but it's also delivered totally differently. So, yeah, it's interesting. But yeah, like I said before, as I have more time, I'm going to refine and refine and refine. So, if someone's like, hey, this part was robbing, let's fix it. And I'll be like, okay. You know, I only have my 2 ears, you know, and sometimes they don't hear stuff. Yep. So happy to hear what other people think, for sure.
Yeah. Well, so I'm thinking about Scott Ald, who says hi, by the way. Scott was he was referring to, he and I had a conversation. He very kindly drove me from our hotel to Sunshine Moot this past year at Sunshine Moot. And he and I in the car had a conversation about audiobooks and audiobooks themselves being adaptations. And the thing that led me to say was, I was like, well, yes, an audiobook is an adaptation, but then again, so is a printed book, as you can have a quite different experience reading two different editions of a print book with totally different sizes of paper, fonts. I mean, it can be a very different experience.
Yeah.
Texture of paper. I mean, it can really, all of these things. And it just, it brings me back, Maggie, it brings me back to the conversation we had with John Howe a couple of years ago about what is there's a sense in which everything, like the printed Lord of the Rings itself, is an adaptation. And not just because of the print, like the words of the Lord of the Rings themselves are Tolkien's attempt to render this thing he had in his head, right? And I have no doubts that he himself would say that he didn't do it perfectly, right? That there are places where the words failed to accomplish what he wanted to accomplish. Almost all artists say that. And with John Howe, Jordan, we were talking about this because we were talking about illustration and talking about Tolkien as a painter, as well, an artist, visual artist, as well as a writer. And we were talking about those moments where you can see him trying to get at the same thing in words and with paint, and and neither one the same, neither one of them necessarily perfectly capturing the thing.
I would imagine, and I might be wrong with this, but I would imagine, because I got to work on that audiobook with John Howe for his Ultimate Fantasy workshop book, and it seems like a lot of John's methodology, if you want to call it that, is like kind of they're adaptations, so we're going to move on and just do it.
Right.
Like, that seems the way that he kind of operates. And I will maybe take this opportunity to say that I mentioned the appendices and things like that, but people like John Howe talking about his version of art, or whatever it might be, or a filmmaker or director listening to Peter talk about the movie on the DVDs, all of that stuff is things where I have a kind of list that I take note on of conceptual thought processes or things like that, and I'm always like, oh, that's kind of a cool nugget, and then I'll interpret it in terms of audio, how I could take that idea and use it in audio. So always trying to think of how other people interpret things and see if, like, maybe I can do that same kind of idea with music or sound effects or whatever it may be. And what you said, Corey, is a good example where if Tolkien, and I'm by no means comparing myself to Tolkien here, but if the words might not get across what he wanted in the depth that he might want, maybe the music for certain points can do that, or can help to do that a little bit. That's the hope during some of these scenes, for sure. Yeah.
And back to what I was saying about Other Minds and Hands, and the ways in which the visions of others can, because again, it's the other thing, right? We all have, not only is the book that Tolkien wrote itself, in that sense we were talking about, an adaptation, but the story that we all have in our heads after we've read the book is our adaptation.
Mine's different than yours.
Yeah, 100%.
It'll change every time you read it.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And and with yours, where you listen to it, like mine's going to be attached to this car trip I just took. So wherever I listen to it again, I'll be in the car.
Totally,
but next time it might be when I'm hiking in the woods. Like, it's a very different experience depending on your situation.
Yeah. One of the things that I found so striking, Jordan, have been finding so striking as I've been going through and listening to the whole thing, I do find it, in a way that I have a hard time even describing, to be a quite different experience from just, even though, like, I'm doing this with the Rob English reading, right, which I've heard literally dozens of times, right? I've listened to Rob English's recording of The Lord of the Ring dozens and dozens of times, and it's the same recording, like, and it's, I'm fully aware of that, like, it's as familiar as ever, but it's a very different experience hearing it with the soundscape. I can feel exactly what you were describing about the four different things, of which the narration is one, and not necessarily more important in a sense, right? I'm very conscious of the fact. And often I will find, and I was finding it again when we were just listening to that part from the Bridge of Khazad-dûm, right? I find that I pay less attention to the words, that the words themselves are like, the way that you described it a few minutes ago is kind of helping me to process how that experience is different, because you're right. Like, I am experiencing the words, which are normally like 100% what I'm paying attention to. I'm experiencing the words as a contributing part. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
You have that version already. So
yeah,
for me to get an audiobook and if I were, to compare to this kind of idea maybe that's been done in the past, where, a little bit of music is put in here and there for audiobooks, it would be like if I gave you the soundscape and turned it down like, 5 or 6 degrees.
Right.
And be like, okay, here you go. And it's like, well, if you want just the words, you can just listen to the audiobook.
Right.
Or read the book. You know what I mean? It's not, this is different than that. It's just like if you, put on a show that's animation and you don't like that animation, then you don't, you know what I mean? Like, you go to a different medium from what you're experiencing to get that other experience. You don't like feel like, oh, I can't hear the words, like, because there's music in the way. You know what I mean? You come to this for those other things. And it is interesting because as I was going through and working through these passages and stuff like that, there are moments where the perfect example is when the poetry happens, that's the focus, and other points where some stuff, it's like on the edge of getting buried and it's like super close, because I want the impact of what's actually happening to be so strong. Like when Grand hits, it's really loud.
Right.
And it's like almost too loud, and it's some people will say it's too loud, which is why it's cool, because you can adjust that yourself. But to go back to what we said at the beginning when you were talking about, I'm making a decision to add music or whatnot, it is also fun because there's a version without music.
Right.
So you can not have that, and then you just have like this real world version of
the immersive
what's
part.
happening, without the,
yeah.
Because I know that, a score can be like you said, where it's like you must feel this way right now, which again is the experience. But
right.
You can, with the soundscape, you can not have that as well, and it's fun to listen to. I have synced versions for myself that are no music, and sometimes it's fun to just have just the ambience, not even the sound effects.
Yeah.
It depends on your kind of mood. So you kind of have the book, the audiobook, the movies, and then like 3 or 4 other versions from the soundscape that you can check out. So
yeah.
And
that is a really interesting, and in its way, I almost want to say like a very generous and thoughtful kind of approach of yours, to be able to give people that, you are not just saying, this is my art, take it or leave it, but to say like,
they're putting it out there and saying,
I can't believe how few, and I don't know what the behind the scenes for this is, but the fact that like Rian Johnson released a version of The Last Jedi that's score only is amazing. And I can't believe that people don't do that more. Like, imagine watching the Lord of the Rings movies with just the score. It would be so fascinating to go through it that way.
Yeah.
And so I just love that, because it all boils down to just, like, what mood am I in? Do I want to listen to just the sound effects or everything, or, what do I want to hear? So, and go ahead, sorry.
No, it's just making me think of other things. Like one of my favorite bands is Muse, and one of their first albums, Absolution, they put out an instrumental version with no lyrics, and it still blows my mind. Like, that is the album I'll turn to when I need to like have a minute of brainwave. And Absolutely. You know, like there's a reason we put on film scores to study to and work to more often than other
Music alone can do more than what words can, because you get to interpret it and not have, because the words in a way, Corey, are what you said with the loaf of bread.
Right.
It's saying that you have, that this exact thing happened.
Yeah.
Right. You
And
can
so
you can
when you
turn
pull that
Tolkien's
out-
illustration back around on
exactly.
it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that's a pretty cool.
But the words
know-
are still open to interpretation. Don't worry.
They-
We still
yeah.
have
Yeah, yeah.
analysis here. Yeah.
Yeah. But it's cool to be able to listen to. A good example might be when there's some pretty intense music that happens when Boromir is confronting Frodo. It gets very like schizophrenic almost, and if anyone's watched the movie The Village, it's inspired by some stuff in that. But listening to that without the narration is interesting, because it puts you in a kind of situation where you have to think about what's happening instead of getting the direct words and listening to what they're saying. You're like, oh my gosh, this is maybe what he's feeling, and what does that mean? And here's this theme, and there's the ring theme coming in, and you can feel it taking over a little bit and stuff like that. And yeah, you get to experience the scene in a way that you get to interpret it almost a little bit more, or in a different way maybe than with the words themselves.
Yeah. Very cool. Very cool. Awesome. Well, there's a lot more we could talk about, but we also wanted to we want to segue here at the end, before we end. There's lately a whole bunch of current events that we need to address. Yes, deluge of news, which we wanted to at least acknowledge, so we won't have time to discuss much in full. So we'll let you go, Jordan. We won't put you on the spot and ask for your public opinions on all the recent news. But Jordan, thank you so much for the last 2 episodes. This has been just wonderful.
And for kind of
thank you
changing
so
my
much.
perspective on a lot of things I thought I knew about adaptation. So I'm really grateful for a fresh set of ears.
Yeah. Well, I'm excited to hear what people think, and we mentioned the code last time, so that's still
So that's jordanrannells.com, which we'll put the link in the description, and the code is Signum 25, was it?
Yep,
Signum 25 discount code for listeners. Wonderful. Thanks so much, Jordan. Really great stuff,
you.
and we'll hope to talk to you again at some point.
May it
Sounds
continue.
good. Thanks so much. Thank you.
Very good. Thanks, Jordan.
Bye. Oh, what fun.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah.
Such good stuff.
It's so, I mean, maybe it happens to you more, but it just doesn't for me, of just having all these fresh ways of looking at something you thought you knew. And he's so thoughtful in how he composes, not just his music, but his art, and putting it all together. It's a masterclass in adaptation practice, and how some studio hasn't snatched him up, I'm not quite sure. Hey, Signum Studios has some words for you, Jordan.
Yes. Oh man. No, it's amazing stuff. I would like at some point to have Jordan back to talk about, like, basically to look at film scoring, and I would love to do more like comparing, like to get Jordan's, like, from his perspective, like with what he does with audio stuff, to be looking at the audio and the scores of a film adaptation, and then think about, like, how is that similar, how is that different to what he would do and how he would do. Anyway, it would be really interesting to talk about some of that stuff.
With that. And to just kind of talk, we haven't really talked much about scores except when we were talking to Bear.
Yeah.
But something along the lines of, like, okay, what is the emotion of this scene? The emotion of this scene is indecision. How do you get indecision out of a score? How do you do that with pacing? Like, really looking at some practices of adaptation. That'd be super fun.
Yeah. Yes, it would. Yes, it would.
Okay.
All right.
We have
So
a lot to talk about.
lots of news. We already had Jordan planned for today, and we're gonna still talk to Jordan, but man, we had to acknowledge it. So
And we're
so
not
much
going to go
stuff.
into like crazy detail about any of these things. We're just going to acknowledge these things are coming up.
Yeah, well, because in a sense, we don't have anything yet, even actually, to talk about other than ideas, right? So there's news on
and the media practice of it all dropping at the same time. Like, Like, they all knew what was going to happen and are clearly trying to stab each other in the back.
Yeah, I don't know who's doing the initiating and who's doing
who
this
first,
stabbing, but yeah.
So I think we first heard that Rings of Power is going to have a new trailer dropping tomorrow. So
Yes.
that's probably our
Teaser
most
trailer
pressing.
tomorrow, and word on the street is also they're going to announce the date tomorrow, which I've been begging them for months.
We have a
So
lot of planning to do around this date.
yes, exactly. So yes, so we don't have anything from the Rings of Power yet, but we will very soon. The only thing that I've heard, I've heard people say, for some people saying or speculating like, oh, it seems like it's getting pushed back. Maybe it'll, slip into next year or something like that. And that is not what I'm hearing about that. Like the date I'm expecting them to announce a date this year, tomorrow. So, if I had to guess, and I have no information on this, not because I haven't tried, but I do not have information on this, my guess is it's going to be similar. If I'm projecting a date, I'm projecting September 6th as the drop date for episode 1 of season 2.
That Labor Day weekend?
It's the first Friday of September, basically.
Okay. Do you think they're going to do it serial again, or do you think it's going to be an all drop?
I bet they'll do it serial again.
Okay.
That's what I think.
I kind of wish for both, but if it all dropped at once, we would have a real difficult time doing Rings and Realms.
Oof. Oy. Yeah.
So we've got that coming. We expect a lot of other things dropping from here on out, really. So they're starting to disperse this information. We know there's some events coming up that we would imagine there are things happening at said events. So we'll see where we go.
Yep. There's so again with Rings of Power, by next week we'll have a trailer to discuss. So that'll be fun. Maybe next week. We were gonna thinking about going back to our other scene analysis thing. But with new trailers out, maybe we'll take a look at the Ring of Power trailer next week. First, But anyway, so we'll have a trailer. That'll be fun. That'll be something. That will be more than we've gotten about War of the Rohirrim, which I would also really look forward to someday a trailer dropping on that.
Because that's Christmas, right? Like that's really coming right up.
Kind of is. It's funny.
They released a new logo today, but that's about all the
which, if you hadn't told me it was new, I wouldn't have noticed. To be perfectly honest, like it's very much like.
Oh, I don't know if I can do it. There we go.
There you go. Yeah. Okay. It's so much like their old logo that I wouldn't even have. I mean, I'm not very attentive to these things, but.
And actually, I thought it was a little bit fuzzy. It looked like the photo was out of focus. I was like,
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Jordan saying maybe the War of the Rohirrim will drop a trailer tomorrow too to compete with the Rings of Power trailer.
I would not put it past them.
No,
in the next week, I feel like we're just going to get a deluge of stuff.
Yes. A deluge of stuff. And of course, so speaking of a deluge, of course, the big news a couple days ago was the announcement of the other film that is in the making, due to be released in 2026. Was it 26? And that's The Hunt for Gollum, directed
by Andy Serkis.
By Andy Serkis.
By Peter Jackson.
Starred in by Andy Serkis.
Starring Andy Serkis.
I mean, as always, open mind. I'm ready to see it. We'll see what happens.
It'll be fun to talk about.
I will confess, I was talking about this a little bit at my Grifflet stream last Friday. I'm not real excited. Like I am. My reaction to that announcement is distinctly tepid. And there are a couple reasons why it's not like that I am convinced it's going to be awful or something like that, but reasons why I wasn't like jumping up and down about it. One is that I don't find the Hunt for Gollum story a hugely compelling story. Like, I don't know what their angle's going to be. And what's more, as James Tauber has been pointing out, there are serious like, they implicitly altered the Hunt for Gollum story pretty significantly in the Peter Jackson films, right? Like, the Peter Jackson films, as they exist, are not wholly consistent with the Hunt for Gollum story in the texts, right? So it opens up further questions about, so what are they going to do with a Hunt for Gollum sequence? Exactly. Presumably they're going to make it consistent with the films. So, like, where's it going to go? What's it going to do? What is the story? What's it a story about? Is it a Gollum story? Is it a Gollum POV story? Like, you know, is it from Gollum's point of view? What's going on here?
Weren't they talking about being a two-parter?
Maybe. I don't remember.
I feel like I read that it was a two-parter. I don't really have a strong reaction to either. I'm like, when I read the headline, I went, oh, because it's interesting. I mean, obviously, nostalgia's sake, it's our old favorites. Sure, that's a good time. But
maybe
the nostalgia only gets you to about point 1.
Yeah.
And they're asking us to get to point 10 right off the bat. And I'm not invested in, this storyline. It feels a little... Desperate seems like a very judgy word to use at this point. But I'm like, but why this one as opposed to something else?
Yeah.
And if you're going to come out with something like this and release it that way, I kind of would have expected more of an artist statement from the creators. I'm choosing this because we have something creative and interesting to say.
That's what I'm hoping to hear, and I haven't heard yet.
Fill in the gap.
Yes.
Yeah, and get us excited with you about this specific thing. Because right now we're all just kind of going, really?
Right. Right. No, Eric, she was saying from the first point to the 10th point. Not, yes. She wasn't speaking in mathematical decimal terms.
No. No, I should have gone from A to no.
Yeah. But yeah. No, exactly. That was what I was missing, right? I'm like, don't just give me
the hook.
We're doing a Gollum film and it's going to star Andy Serkis, and so therefore it will be awesome. And I'm like, no, that's not
enough for me to get on board. That's enough for me to be interested to open the article. But if you're not going to tell me why now and why this story, then yes. I'm going to be dubious.
Tell me what makes this, like, what is compelling about this story? Like, tell me what is the story that you want to tell? You know, why this story, as you said, like and none of those questions were, yeah.
And especially with Andy Serkis, like, I get it. You're Gollum. I get it.
But I'm hoping that there's more to get than that.
Right. But
right. Like, please tell me the's more than we'd like to get Andy Serkis as Gollum on screen more. Like, there has to be more than that. Yeah.
Yes, I don't want to go in negative, but I am going in questioning. Where there's other adaptations, I go in just ecstatic, and I'm just feeling kind of like, okay, well, give me the emotional hook, give me a bit more of a creative statement, and then I might get on board. And yeah, agreed, Druid's Fire, like, everybody's burned because of the Gollum game. It's a little bit of a risk to, like, come on after the... I don't want to say it was a total flop, but it disappointed.
It was almost a total flop.
Yeah.
But and actually, for that reason alone, I needed more of a hook, right? Like, you can't expect the Tolkien public, who is starting in, as you say, with this baseline, the Gollum story again, because of the Gollum game. I mean, like, you've got to give me a reason to be excited other than, like, hey, everyone, we're returning to the favorite story that you've loved every time. You know, it's...
Yeah, we talk a lot about the ask of the audience, and I feel like it's just a little too high in this regard. Like, you can't just assume we're going to be thrilled. Like, our ask is a little higher than it was in 2001 when social media didn't exist. Mm-hmm. Like, we've all had the opportunity to talk to each other and to say, that wasn't great. We wish they had done this. This would have been better if, here's a better idea. Like, there's a lot more discourse around that. So I think you have to be aware that your engagement has changed too. So if you're going to come out with a statement, you better make it a little bit deeper than we have Andy Serkis doing Gollum.
And I have to say that for me personally, nostalgia doesn't even get me to point 1, honestly. Like, I want to be careful because I'm going to sound like a hater saying this, but, like, to me, further Tolkien films that star the original cast, like, it stars the original cast of the old cast from the Lord of the Rings films is not, to me, by itself, like a reason to get excited. I wouldn't be excited about it for that reason. I don't think there's a single member of the cast that would by himself get me excited to see the next film. And in fact, in some cases, I really hope we don't. And I love Ian McKellen's performance as Gandalf. Love it. I hope we don't get Gandalf played by an 85-year-old man in this movie. I'm sorry. But even the Hobbit movies were a little hard to watch. But then
you also run the risk of them de-aging Ian McKellen, which can also just be jarring because you're analyzing the CG as opposed to experiencing the story. So like I would be super excited anytime those guys reunite at a con and like post their pictures on Instagram of them redoing the jig in the pub. Like I'm there for this. Like this is the content my fangirl heart is happy. But enjoying the reuniting of the cast is a fangirl moment. Enjoying the creation that they make is an art engagement. So if you're getting those guys back, but you're not giving the service and the depth and the joy and commitment to the story that you gave originally, and you have 20 years more on those actors.
Yes.
It's a big ask.
It is, especially since as Eric points out, we keep using older and older actors to play younger and younger versions of the characters as well. And it's, anyway, like I said, I don't have anything against the original cast, but again, I've heard people saying things like, oh, like, I'm so excited that they're doing these films now. Like, I want them to get as many films as they can in while they can still get Ian McKellen in them, and they can still get. And I'm like, no, please, no, just
end on a high. It's like TV series that end when they're at their peak. Like, yes,
right.
Just cancel it when it's
right.
great.
Or like sports players who retire on top instead of like waiting until they're a shell of themselves. And yes. No, anyway, it's, as I said, it was one of the things, it was only one, but it was one of the things that made the Hobbit movies hard to watch for me. It's just that it was like, I knew I was supposed to, I felt like I was supposed to love it because I was seeing Christopher Lee and I was seeing Ian McKellen and I'm seeing Orlando Bloom, right, all again, right? But honestly, my favorite casting in that entire thing was, I'm getting so old myself, blanking on his name, Bilbo,
Martin
Freeman, forgot the last name, Martin somebody or other, Martin Freeman was my favorite casting. Like, yes, like, would it have been fun? Like, again, people are like, oh, it was too bad they couldn't get Ian home to do that and de-age him. And I'm like, are you kidding me? That would not have been good.
But that was also a fresh storyline, like a fresh cast made sense for a fresh storyline. This is in the world, right? So, like, a fresh casting is going to be real tough to do in that. But the other thing I found...
I think it would be fine. Like, I'm ready for a new Gandalf. I love Ian McKellen. I'm ready for new Gandalf.
And think about Dumbledore from, what was it, 2 to 3? He changed. Like, you deal with it quick. There's the initial jar, and then as long as they're good casting, you tend to just be fine with it. All
just
these
as I'm hoping for Adar in season 2 of Rings of Power.
Yes, exactly. I was gonna say all these petitions when you find out that somebody's been recast, and you're like, no. But as long as they cast well, a recasting can be absolutely fine. The other thing I found really interesting about this that we don't need to dig too deep into, it was just kind of like a neat moment, especially in fan studies, was the fan film made in 2009 with the same title and has a huge viewership. It's like 15 million views online. Yeah. Called The Hunt for Gollum. So this is a fan-made film. And it's not like it's a copy because it's a piece of story that everybody knows. But there's no way they weren't aware of this fan film with a huge following and then decided to do something of the same ilk and not acknowledge it. And then that film was taken down for, I think, 24 hours, which they said was a bot. It was automatically taking down things that copied it. Now it's back up. But there is this kind of baseline element of you had to be aware of that. And why not talk to people or incorporate that or be careful about that or acknowledge that or at least keep it alive and have the owner say, I can't wait to see this version, or just something to just kind of mitigate that process.
Yeah.
But that
So
was kind of fascinating to watch unfold.
it is. It was. Yeah. It was. It was very interesting. And anyway, so no, it would be. Yeah, again, I hate to. I don't want to start off all negative about the hunt for Gollum, but I am very open to it being very interesting. In part, honestly, one of the things to try to put this in a positive frame, one of the reasons I was disappointed about the hunt for Gollum announcement is that I love the War of the Rohirrim concept so much. Like, that is so gorgeous. They've chosen a fresh story. A beautiful, I mean, a powerful story from the a third age story from the appendix, the story of Helm Hammerhand, which is not only a really compelling story, but it's a perfect story in scope for a feature film. It's like a short story, so they don't have to do massive compression to try to get it. It's a wonderful bite-sized feature film story. And the whole idea of the frame, I mean, if we're understanding that properly based on what we've been told about the Eowyn frame, and she's telling stories to her kids, and brilliant, like lovely. That's just, I was really hoping the War of the Rohirrim concept. Again, I know nothing about the logo, the old logo, the new logo, and those, few things we've been told about the context of the story and the fact that it's animated. I know almost nothing else about the War of the Rohirrim, but it got me excited for the possibility of a whole series like that, like with a similar kind of frame. Like, tell me, like a series of movies that would be like Tales from the Third Age of Middle Earth. Right. And I'm like, yeah, let's do it. That's great. And then like Hunt for Gollum with Andy Serkis, and I'm like, oh, come on, that's not where I was hoping we were going.
I genuinely am still excited for it. We're gonna have a lot of fun. It's gonna be interesting to see what they do, but reservations, as Druid's Fire said, of just, there's some things I'm kind of wondering about. And like you said, there's so much amazing content that we haven't seen.
Yes.
That I'm itching for. And even if you're not a fan, if you don't know the whole lore of Tolkien, enough of the world now because of Peter Jackson that an adjacent story well told would go the way of the Disney Star Wars films and series. Like, as long as you understand the world, a really well told story in that world. Yeah. Pretty cool.
Exactly. Yeah. You get something like, again, people complain about the Disney Star Wars stuff, but you get some really good stuff like
Andor,
and
things I've seen.
The first couple seasons of The Mandalorian and, the Star Wars Rebel animated series, like
Boba Fett. Yeah. There
was great stuff.
And the Boba Fett was still a throwback, so you had that moment of nostalgia, but you're seeing a whole storyline and a whole community attached to Mandalorian that we hadn't considered or engaged with that kind of depth, and it was great.
Yeah, I am interested to see all this. But of course, in addition, besides all of this, there's also been just today, right? That story that was released by the Embracer with an interview with the head of the Embracer group talking
about. Which
was
such a lovely interview. Like, yes. I want to sit down and have a chat with these guys because they just seem like a good bunch of eggs that are just really interested in telling good stories. Yeah, and that's the juicy content, and there wasn't much in the way of detail, but the juicy content is there's a whole wave of new games that are coming that will be set in Middle Earth. Which, of course, we all suspected was going to be the case, but it's interesting to hear them talk about it. Yeah, I'll see if I can find the headline because it was pretty good, wasn't it? But
yeah. So yeah, there'll be a lot to do there. And again, some of it will be good, some of it will be less good. There's lots of very different kind of genres and things. JJ says he's still waiting for a Shire pie delivery game. JJ's making a reference to the pie delivery quests at the beginning of Lord of the Rings Online, which are sort of famous in Lotro. So they're famous in the sense of like getting you to do hobbity things where you go around delivering pies to people, and then you discover that there was something wrong with the pies, so you have to go around to everybody again, and there's like a lot of like that kind of thing happening in those early quest lines in Lotro and the Shire. Very hobbity, right? Mail delivery quests and pie delivery quests and things like that. very different from your normal like epic questing fare. But yeah, Tales of the Shire looks like it's designed to scratch exactly that kind of itch. In fact, JJ, from what I hear, delivering pies to people might even be a little bit too action intensive for Tales of the Shire potentially. That might be a little over the top. I'm not completely sure. Yeah, anyway, I think
we've got a lot coming.
There's a lot coming. There will be a lot to talk about, which just, Maggie, makes me like triply thankful that we have undertaken this undertaking, right? It's been a great time to be talking about adaptation, and I feel so much more prepared to receive, and think about the deluge than certainly than I was prior to this.
Yeah, and it was fun recently to like kind of go through, because we're kind of thinking about season 2 of Rings and Realms. We don't know enough yet to really prep. It's just starting to kind of organize our brains a little bit. So I was going through a load of the comments and stuff from last year and like our initial ideas of why we should do this and get together. And I'd forgotten our tagline of a rational space to discuss adaptation. And that's perfect. Like, that's what we've always been. Like, no, we don't have opinion. We have analysis. So yes, we share our opinions. We know. But
right. But no, it's not about, our discussion is never about like, here's what I think about this.
Let me try to persuade you.
Yeah,
no,
that this sucks or that this is great.
Here's
or whatever.
what I think, but let me tell you why I might think that. And here's a tool, and let's talk about that. And
it's all interesting to think about and talk about. And even I could, I mean, obviously I'm a much more casual Star Wars fan than I am a Tolkien fan. But even there, like, I've been interested to see all of the stuff that they've been doing. I'm a little bit behind now. I haven't seen Ahsoka yet. That's where I fell off.
Either,
I've been doing other things. I tend to be kind of sporadic about these things. Like I go back and I'll watch a bunch of them all at once, and then I'll go do something else for a while. So I haven't watched the latest of the. In fact, what I've recently been doing is I was the same thing with like the Marvel stuff. Like I was behind on the Marvel stuff, so I'm like catching up on a bunch of the newer Marvel stuff. But anyway, I've been really interested to see the Star Wars stuff coming out and seeing the kinds of things that they're doing, the kinds of stories that they're telling, the different approaches to storytelling, the way that they're building that world. There's a lot of really interesting things to think about there, and I will be fascinated to see the kind of stuff. And I think that we've got an opportunity. It would be fun. We're still figuring out what to do. I wonder if there would be, any chance we could even expand Rings and Realms, to be talking about other things as well.
Of course. I think so. We're a little self-serving, but like, absolutely. Like, the space to talk about adaptation practice and tools is just so vast because there's so much beautiful work going on. Like, we've been doing this for, 2 years now?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's mad.
Yeah.
And we have yet to even discuss a Harry Potter or a Marvel, which are my top 2 fields.
Right. Right.
Like that's because we've just filled our space with so many other interesting things to talk about, and all of it has been really fun and engaging, and I hope helpful. So I look forward to the next one. But next week we're probably just going to be talking about the trailer for Rings of Power.
Mm-hmm. Probably so. So. And we'll see. Again, it'll be interesting to keep track of the multiple things going on. The one thing I'd remind people as the new stuff is coming out, remember, I'm still firmly of the opinion, so here I'm stating my opinion, I'm still firmly of the opinion that there is a very important, these next few years are very important moments in the, determining the future history of Tolkien adaptation in particular, because we must remember that there are 2 different licenses held by 2 different groups of people. And it's all about genre, right? There's the serial TV, like the streaming TV license held by Amazon. Nobody else can do streaming TV on Tolkien except Amazon. And then there's the feature film license that is currently situated with Warner Brothers. So we've got 2 different companies, one of whom has the rights to make TV shows and the other of which has the rights to make feature films. And there's a real question about, is one of them going to dominate? Like, is there gonna be? And I still hold the view that the Tolkien estate is waiting to sell the Silmarillion rights until they find out more about which one's going to work better. So I think that there's actual stakes involved in this kind of competition.
And in the meantime, we'll reap all the awards.
That's right. We'll get to see it all. We'll get to talk about all this stuff. Anyway, yeah. So I think that this is just, for me, I just want to remind folks, this is that's the big picture that I kind of have my popcorn out for, that I'm kind of watching. And it really goes beyond I don't think The Rings of Power is a great show. It's a much more complicated question than which group makes the better thing. Because it's not just two different studios making movies and whose movies are better, right? It really is about what is the direction of the entire industry, basically.
And it's a much bigger legacy question too.
Yeah.
So it's industry, where are we going? Streaming serial, streaming film, blockbuster film, cinema film, but also legacy of Tolkien. So which one is going to, when you Google Tolkien, what's going to show up? Tolkien? Jackson?
Right.
Yet to be determined creator we're not familiar with
at this point. I promise you, images from the Peter Jackson films are going to come up even when they're talking about Tolkien.
Absolutely.
Right. Yep.
Anywho, so
all right.
So next week I'm in California, but I think I can do this the same time next week.
Okay, so you're gonna be behind us instead of ahead of us next week, right?
Yes. Yeah. Instead of really late, I'll be middle of the day.
Okay, fair enough. All right, great. So we'll plan on almost certainly Rings. Well, we'll definitely talk about the Rings of Power trailer next week. Whether we talk about anything else will depend on whether the other things also drop trailers this week to compete with it. So we'll see.
That sounds
Anyway,
like a good plan. We'll see what else we get this week.
Yeah, that's right. Lots of stuff. All right, very good. Thanks, everybody. See you guys next week. Bye now.
Bye.